Hello friends. Today we are going to discuss about national ethical guidelines for biomedical and health research involving human participants. In simple word, ICMR ethics guidelines for biomedical research 2017. I am Dr. Suresh Badadmat, Professor of Psychiatry, working at National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences, Bangalore. In this video, I'll be defining ethics, how the ethics of research evolved over a period of time, and finally, the ICMR Guidelines 2017 will be discussed. Let's understand what is ethics. Ethics is a generic term for referring the moral code of conduct in a civil society. That is, how the people behave, what are their moral conscience is considered as ethics. It is not only concerned about the rules, customs, and the beliefs of the society, but also scholarly efforts to interpret and follow them. As per Oxford Dictionary, ethics has been defined as a set of principles of morals, science of morals, and rules of conduct of a group, organization, or an individual. Ethics is also considered as a moral philosophy, and it is a branch of philosophy that involves systematizing, defending, and recommending the concepts of right and wrong behavior for a human being. Philosophical reasoning to decide whether an action or a behavior is right or wrong. Relativeness to the acceptable, unacceptable behavior or action, good or bad behavior of a person in a given time and a society. Now let's understand how research ethics evolved over a period of time. For the first time, from the background from the Western country, the Nuremberg Code of 1947, immediately after the Second World War, when the soldiers and the public at large were subjected to various research by the Nazis. Hence, the Nuremberg Code was found out in Second World War, that is around 1947. They talked about every individual who is subjected to research should be able to give consent, that is voluntariness was brought in. In 1964, the World Medical Association formulated the guidelines for conducting research on humans, and it is also known as Declaration of Helsinki. There are several editions of updating of World Medical Association's ethics guidelines have been done till date. But the comprehensive ethics for research came in Belmont Report. The Belmont Report was the consequences of Tuskegee syphilis experiment which occurred in US. This syphilis experiment occurred between 1932 to 72. That means 4 decades in US. This was done in Tuskegee, Alabama, that is in the US. The US Public Health Service wanted to study the evolution of syphilis. Hence, they chose Tuskegee, that is Alabama, which is black predominant state, where 600 black men were recruited for the study. In that, more than 399 people were diagnosed to have been suffering from syphilis, and 201 were normals, that is without disease. All of these black men never knew what is happening with them. They were offered free meals, medical care, and free burial insurance. They thought that they have been given some privilege, but they were the subject with regard to US Health Department observation about how syphilis evolves in human being. In 1947, the penicillin was found effective in the treatment of syphilis. But over a period of next 40 years, none of these black men were given penicillin injection or were offered. They were not allowed to go to the neighboring districts for treatment also. None of the study participants knew there is penicillin available and they were suffering from syphilis. And nobody knew what is happening with them. There was no informed consent. That means they were treated as a second-class citizen in US. The John Heller, the head of PHS, that is Public Health System of US, continued to defend that the men's status did not warrant ethical debate. They were subjects, not patients. They are not clinical materials. They are not sick people. They are observation human beings. This occurred over a period of 4 decades, my dear friends. That is in US. That too after the Second World War, when Nuremberg Code was declared, World Medical Association talked about Lindsay Declaration. This continued to occur under the US government. Finally, the journalist Peter Buxton made a headline in Washington Star, July 25, 1972, and it was the front page discussing about how the blacks were treated. Immediately, the study was put to stop and banned. And after many years, that is during 2001, the president of US asked apology for the participants in the study. But however, only 2 or 3 people survived in this whole study. Immediately, there was a human cry, and the US government had to appoint a commission. And that commission is Belmont Commission. And the report, which was published in 1978, is considered as a Belmont report. This brought in 3 important aspects: respect for person, beneficiency, and justice whenever you do any kind of research on human beings. Later, over a period of time, 3 more were added: autonomy, that is, the patient has the right to refuse or choose what treatment they want; non maleficency, that means nobody should do harm, especially the healthcare service personnel; truthfulness and honesty should be there. These are the 6 important ethical principles which needs to be followed whenever we do research on human beings: autonomy, beneficiency, non-maleficency, justice, truthfulness and honesty, and respect for person. In this background, the ICMR ethics guideline also came into picture. If you look at the history of ICMR, a similar study was conducted in India also, similar to Tuskegee trial. Cervical dysplasia, cancerous, precancerous lesions were studied in more than 1,000 women, and nobody knew they were observed for this lesion. Nobody was offered even the treatment. Again, finally, this study was banned, and the ICMR guidelines came into picture. The first guideline was in 1980. The second edition came in 2000. Third is 2006, and at present, 2017 guidelines, what we are practicing. So today I'll be discussing about national ethical guidelines for biomedical research and health research involving human participants. As I mentioned, 2017 ethical guideline is very comprehensive, and it has many chapters. It discusses in detail about various participants, what are the ethical guidelines, and how the ethics committee to be formed, what are their roles and responsibility, what is the role and responsibility of researcher, and the institution has been clearly demarcated. This ICMR Ethical Guideline 2017 has 12 chapters, 2 annexures, and there are 7 new chapters have been added when compared to 2000 edition. It has totally 187 pages and comprehensive document. These are the 12 different chapters which are there in this guideline. These are the chapters which have been added in the 2017 guidelines. That means these are the 7 chapters which are newly introduced. The first chapter is Statement of General Principles. Here, there are 12 important General principles have been enumerated, and these are to be followed in true spirit. The first one is principle of essentiality. You cannot do research at your whims and fancies. The research should be beneficial to our society. That means essentiality of the society is very essential. You should not do research for the sake of doing. It should be answering the human problems. The second one is principle of voluntariness. That means the person should volunteer to be part of the research. Principle of non exploitation. You're not going to exploit the poor people, marginalized, tribal people. Such kind of exploitation should be kept away from the research. Principles of social responsibility. We have a being a human being working towards the social welfare. We need to have social responsibility so that the people who are suffering, and we need to find a new treatment and understand their disease. That social responsibility should be the main focus of this human research. Principles of ensuring privacy and confidentiality. Any person who is a participant, their confidentiality and privacy should be kept at utmost. Principle of risk minimization. All efforts should be done so that the risk to the participants should be as minimal as possible. Principles of professional competence. That means the person who is a so called researcher should be qualified, having adequate degree, and being trained in research should be doing the research. That means competency is very essential. Principles of maximization of benefit. If you're doing the research, the benefit should be the maximum outweighing the risk. Principles of institutional arrangements. The institution where the research is conducted should take the responsibility over forming of IEC, that is Institutional Ethics Committee, and also the researcher's code of conduct, and also they have to make ensure that the risk and the benefit outweighs in the benefit of the participants. Principle of transparency and accountability towards the researcher. He should not rig the data and he should be transparent over it. Principle of total responsibility. Here, the researcher is completely accountable for any kind of untoward incidents, and he has to bear the complete responsibility. And finally, the environmental protection. That means if you are doing a research on human beings, the environmental protection should be to be considered utmost. The second chapter is general ethical issues. The ethical issues like benefit versus risk assessment, informed consent process, privacy and confidentiality, distributive justice. That means every person should be given equal opportunity to be part of be the participant in the research. You should not selectively take only poor people. Representation of the population should be followed. Payment for participation, especially for their time, for their travel, for their whatever loss of wages should be compensated. Compensation for research related harm. If something happens to them during the research, the insurance should be there. Ancillary care. If the person has any kind of harm, the treatment should be given within the institute or the institute take the responsibility for providing care to them. Conflict of interest of the researcher should be minimal, or else he should move out of this research or he should declare the conflict of interest. Selection of vulnerable and special group as a research participant. There should be protection mechanism, and also the legal guardian should sign for the informed consent. Community engagement is very essential, especially whenever the research is involving larger community. Post research access and benefit sharing to the population at large should be considered. Moving to the third chapter, responsible conduct of research. Here, in this chapter, the ICMR endorses the publication policy of International Committee of Medical Journal Editors on authorship. That means the researcher, if he wants to publish, the authorship should follow this guideline. The first author should be, also the other authors should have done a substantial contribution to the conception designing of the work, or the acquisition, analysis, and interpretation of the data of the work, drafting the work, revising it for intellectual content, final approval of the version to be published, agreement to be the accountable of all aspects of the work, and ensuring the questions related to accuracy or integrity of any part of the work are appropriately investigated and resolved. That means the authorship is very important and these guidelines should be followed. Further, the ICMR guideline also talks about publication policy. The primary author should be the person who has done most of the research work related to manuscript and also writing the protocol, conducting the research, analyzing, interpreting, and writing the manuscript. Hence, the author is one who has substantial contribution is done. With regard to thesis, invariably, this ICMR guideline urges all the researcher to give the student as the first authorship. The reason being, we need to groom them as to be the researchers. During this process, the guides should groom them with regard to conceiving the idea of the protocol, the research questions, writing the protocol, methodology, collecting the data, analyzing, writing, and also publishing. In the whole process, the guide would have done the maximum work. With regard to intellectual, the student would have most probably would be collected the data and would have written it. In spite of that, ICMR guideline is very clear. Give an opportunity to the student as the first author and also ask them to publish. However, if the student does not publish, the institute can have its own policy with regard to publication. Some of the institutions have come up with their own publication policies. ICMR guideline encourages this. If there is any authorship issues, in such a scenario, the journals are advised to write back to the institutional head, explaining about the authorship conflict and let the institute take the decision. The ICMR guideline is very clear. The data belongs to the institution, not for the author or the researcher. It is the institutional data. The institution can take the call whether the student will continue to publish it or the researcher. Further, this guideline also talks about various research misconduct with regard to fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism of research. With regard to international studies, if you are a researcher who would like to collaborate with international researchers, you need to register the trial. That is, trial registration in CTRI is made mandatory under the CEDESCO notification on 15 June 2019 for all clinical trials. Further, if there is a funding coming from foreign countries, health ministries screening committee will screen the protocol. What is the need of the study? Why should there is a collaboration needed with the international? What are the materials transferred between the two countries? Who is going to hold the intellectual property rights? How much the Indian researcher will gain? Based upon all this, health ministries screening committee will take decision whether such research will be conducted or not. If there is any material transfer occurs between the two countries, there is a need for an important agreement which should be signed by both the research parties. Further, if the funds are transferred, Foreign Contribution Regulation Act 2010 and their rules need to be followed. Moving to the chapter 4, ethical review procedures. In this, it is very essential the new Drugs and Clinical Trials Rules 2019, which is the rules are formed under the Drugs and Cosmetic Act of 1940. Chapter 4, Ethics Committee for Biomedical and Health Research, states that all ethics committee reviewing biomedical research should be registered with the authority designated by the central government in the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, Department of Health Research. That means if you are going to do any clinical trial in an institution, that institution ethics committee should be registered under the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, Department of Health Research. Further, the ethics committee of the institute also should be registered with the SEDESCO. The clear cut, the link also has been given. Further, approving biomedical research other than clinical trials, the committee also to be registered with the Department of Health Research. Each of this ethics committee, once the approval is given, it is valid for 5 years. And before the expiry of this approval, that is before 90 days, they need to resubmit for renewal of the permission. Further, all clinical trials need to be registered under ICMR, that is, clinical trial registry has to be done. This trial registration in the CTRI was made mandatory on 15 June 2019 by SEDESCO. Registration with CTRI is voluntary for biomedical and health research, and most of the journals will ask for CTRI registry number. Further now, how the ethics committee is formed. The ethics committee should consist of 7 to 15 members. Minimum 7, maximum 15. 50% of the members should be from the outside the institute. And the maximum tenure is 3 years and minimum is 2 years. Quorum for the IC should be 5 members. And these members should represent medical, non-medical, layperson, non-affiliated, and chairperson. One institute can have one or more institutional ethics committee. For example, if an institution is very large, there are many colleges are there, many research activities are going on. In such a scenario, that institution can form more than 2 to 3 ethics committee. Those ethics committees will be independent and they follow ICMR guideline. Similarly, if there are 3 or 4 institutions are there, but the research activity is very minimal, then the collaboration of these 3 or 5 institutes can form a single ethics committee. Further, they need to follow these guidelines. If you look at the members, they should be chairperson, they can be a vice chairperson also, member secretary, and also deputy member secretary, social scientist, clinician, layman, support staff, legal experts, basic medical scientist, and also a legal person can be brought in. For example, if there is a multi-centered study sponsored either by a multinational company or maybe a pharmaceutical company or even maybe a DBT or ICMR, a single IEC, that is single institutional ethics committee, can be formed, but the ICMR guideline is very clear. The local IEC should also be involved in reviewing the protocol, and they should be involved in looking into the local language related informed consent, what are the culture, whether that study is required for their community or not, and local acceptance of that study should be taken. Further, the head of the institution cannot be part of the IEC. Alternate members can also be added with full power for reviewing the protocol and giving their voting also. A panel of subject experts who are consulted for the subject matter expertise in certain area can be brought in, but they will not have voting power. A separate scientific committee can also be formed to review the protocol before it is sent to institutional ethics committee. That means scientific review can also be done. Further, each protocol submitted should be evaluated on certain parameters. The protocol research, what is the social value of it, what is the scientific design, benefit risk assessment, selection of the study population, how the recruitment of the research participants are done, payment for participation, protection of research participants' privacy and confidentiality, community consideration, qualification of the researcher and adequacy of assessment of the study sites, disclosure, declaration of potential of conflict of interest, plans for medical management and compensation for study related injury, and finally, review of the informed consent forms. When the review is done, the review can take three forms. Either the study can be exempted from the review, expedited, or else full committee review can be done. What do you mean by exemption? Suppose if the data is from the public data which is available online, such as systematics analysis or else meta-analysis, doing with regard to teaching curriculum, public behavior, audit, and public health program, in such studies, exemption from ethics committee has to be done. Invariably, the researcher cannot take decision on his own. He need to say that I am submitting this protocol for this purpose. The institutional ethics committee will take the decision whether it's to be exempted or not. The researcher cannot say that it is exempted on his own. Expedited. Here, if there are simple studies, which is multicentric, where already the main institutional ethics committee has given permission, expedited review can be done here. If there is an amendment for the protocol, expedited review can be done. The expedited review will be done by 2 or 3 members, including chairperson and the member secretary and one more member. And that expedited can be done very fast and the decision can be given to the researcher. However, the full review includes the main ethics committee reviewing the whole protocol. What is the decision given? The decision can be approved, not approved, minor modification and submission, major modification and resubmission. Approved means the study will start. Not approved means clearly rejecting the protocol and reasoning out why they have rejected is very essential. Minor modification. Here, the ethics committee will approve the study in principle and they will ask for minor modification and that should be submitted to ethics committee. The member secretary will give the approval based upon the changes made. Major modification. In such a scenario, the researcher need to do all the modification and resubmit to full review committee. In presence of that, again, it will be presented. However, please remember, if the ethics committee rejects the proposal or the protocol, the researcher have all the right to ask for explanation and he can give his defense regarding this. Further, he needs to be given in writing why the rejection has been done. The researcher can also approach the head of the institution for appellate authority asking for why they have rejected and also asking for redressal mechanism. Moving to the 5th chapter, informed consent process. The informed consent process, that is, the whole form will have 2 parts. One is patient participation information sheet and second one is informed consent form. Each of these, that is participant information sheet, should consist of 10 essential points needs to be covered. 4 optional points have been can be covered and ICF, that is consent form process, needs to be written and it has to be in the local language what the participants understands. Copy of the informed consent form should be given to the participant and if there is a waiver of ICF, this has to be documented, especially with regard to retrospective data. The waiver of informed consent can be taken. Again, the informed consent waiver can be done in certain research where the retrospective data is there, anonymized data is there, file review is done, and also in certain studies with regard to public health, maybe in disaster, research with regard to data available in public domain, and certain studies where the informed consent cannot be taken, the institutional ethics committee can waiver off the informed consent. Moving to the chapter 6, that is vulnerability. The Latin word vulnera means incapable of protecting their own interest. Here, the vulnerable population are children, persons with mental illness, persons with disability, LGBT community, backward community, tribals, refugees, terminally ill patients, prisoners, students, women in pregnancy and lactation, and so forth. In those population, a legal representative consent is essential, especially with children. Assent is mandatory. The oral assent is required between the age of 7 to 12 years, which needs to be documented and signed by the parents. In adolescents between the age of 12 to 18 years, written assent has to be taken and the parents will sign. Assent is vital. If the child or the adolescent refuses to be part of it, it has to be honored. That means informed consent has to be taken by the parents because they are legally adult and their consent becomes valid. If the children or the adolescent refuse, you need to honor them and you should not take them to participate in the study. However, you can approach the ethics committee asking for waiver of the assent form also, similar to informed consent. That means it is very clear the assent of the children is very essential. In certain studies where the risk is very high, especially in children, in such a scenario, both the parents' consent becomes mandatory and institutional ethics committee will take a call on that. Moving to the seventh chapter, clinical trials of drugs. Apart from ethics committee permission, the permission under Drugs and Cosmetic Act of 1940 has to be taken. As per New Drugs and Clinical Trial Rules 2019, all clinical trials need to be registered and all the ethics committee need to be registered under SEDESCO, and all new drugs clinical trial investigational new drug has to come under this new drugs clinical trial and all procedure need to be followed. However, academic clinical trial need to follow the Gazette notification of 16th March 2016. Moving to the chapter 8, public health research. Public health research with regard to national health programs, example National Mental Health Program, District Mental Health Program, Pulse Polio Program, Tuberculosis Program, the program evaluation, impact of these programs, implementation research, public surveillance such as COVID, community trials, life skills implementation program, especially in children. In such a scenario, public health research ethics committee will take a separate understanding about this. The consent can be oral, it can be broad consent, group consent, gatekeeper consent can be taken. Moving to the chapter 9, social and behavioral science research for health. Social and behavioral science include, which are not limited to anthropology, sociology, psychology, philosophy, political science, economic, history, communication, and education. In such a research, community consent, participation consent, waiver of the consent, gatekeeper consent can be taken. Moving to the 10th chapter, human genetics testing and research. Here, ICMR guideline is very clear. Genetic counseling is mandatory. Researcher cannot reveal the genetic information to the family members of the participants without the consent of the participant. Gene therapy and gene editing, if it is done in the research, the consent and the IEC approval has to be taken. Research on human embryos has to be carried out with appropriate permission. Prenatal diagnostics cannot be done, and if it is done, has to be in congruence with the law of the land. Population screening on rare diseases has to be done with caution. Moving to the 11th chapter, biological materials, biobanking, and datasets. In this, the ICMR ethics guidelines clearly talks about three types of datasets. One is unidentified data. When the data or the biomaterial is collected, no identification is collected. Only the blood sample is collected. You will not ask the name, gender, age, geography, anything. Only the blood is collected. Maximum, you may know the diagnosis, but you will not have any identification mark. That is anonymous data. The second one is anonymous data. Here, anonymized means you have collected the data with all identification, but later you are de-identifying the data. That means you will remove all the demographic information from the data for the analysis. One is irreversible anonymizing. That means you will completely delete the demographic details. You cannot go back to the identification. Second one is reversible. That means the data which is sent for analysis will be de-identified, but however, you can go back and look into the identification. Identifiable data means the data will have the complete demographic details of the person. With regard to biological materials, biobanking and data sets, the consent can be blanket, specific, tiered, delayed dynamic waiver, and the option of destruction of material of the samples has to be given when the blood and other materials are taken. The final chapter is research during humanitarian emergency and disasters. Preemptive research preparation protocol has to be submitted to the ethics committee before the disaster occurs. You can take the permission from the ethics committee telling that whenever the disaster occurs, I will be executing this protocol. And the full review committee can occur at that time. In certain times, based upon the disaster, at the nth minute, IEC can be, that is Institutional Ethics Committee, can give an expedited review. It may be unscheduled meeting. Expedited review can be done. Certain times, ethics committees have given waiver of the informed consent simply because taking consent during the disaster is very difficult and it is very sensitive area. Hence, doing research in that situation becomes unethical. But however, research is part and parcel of our human evolution. But you need to be very careful. This research should be the part of the humanitarian relief agencies which are carrying out such research will be approved here. That is about ICMR ethics guideline, my dear friends. At the same time, ICMR also has published Integrity and Public Ethics 2019. That means how the researcher should behave. With regard to this, they have defined various terms such as plagiarism, that is wrongful appropriation, that is stealing and publication of another paper, another author's language, thoughts, ideas, or expression. Accidental plagiarism, when the author neglects or forget to cite the original resource or forgets to refer the original article. Redundant publication or salami publication. This refers to publishing many very similar manuscripts. That means a researcher has submitted an article which is the same with modified title published in another journal. That means same publication in two other journals of similar content, similar research is considered as redundant publication. Further, direct plagiarism. This includes complete or partial direct copying, word by word copying is considered as direct plagiarism. Self-plagiarism is a situation where the person duplicates his previous works or sentence used in a new project or new publication. Mosaic plagiarism, copying of an idea and general structure of the concept of someone by changing the phrase and words. In this, the research integrity and publication ethics needs to be upheld very high. Research integrity unit is established in ICMR. Whenever, if you have taken the funds from ICMR and if there is any complaint with regard to research integrity unit will take the complaint and inquire about this. ICMR Bioethics Unit will be responsible for development and timely updation of policy on research integrity, misconduct, and publication ethics. With regard to review of research documents and handling of research misconduct before publication, dissemination, as per this guidelines, it will be followed. Similarly, handling of misconduct allegation against the researchers will be handled as per this flowchart. It looks very small. I request all the viewers to go back and look into this guideline. Finally, ICMR Artificial Intelligence Guideline 2023. This ethics guidelines for application of artificial intelligence in biomedical research and healthcare. Here the objective is to ensure ethical conduct, addressing the emerging ethical challenges in the field of artificial intelligence, to provide a framework for ethical decision making in medical AI during the development, deployment, adoption of AI based solutions. The content of the guidelines have 5 important chapters. First one is ethical principles, guiding principles of all stakeholders, an ethics review process, governance of AI use, and finally, informed consent. As you see, the first chapter is ethics principles of AI in healthcare. Second one is guiding principles of stakeholders' involvement in development, validation, and employment. Chapter 3 is ethical review procedure of medical AI. Chapter 4 is informed consent. And chapter 5 is governance of AI technology used for healthcare. The ethical principles of medical AI starts with validity, non-discrimination and fairness, optimization and data quality, accessibility and equity, minimization and safety, collaboration, autonomy, data privacy, accountability and liability, trustworthiness are the ethical principles of medical AI. Other ICMR guidelines which have been published are National Ethical Guidelines for Biomedical Research Involving Children 2017 is published. Ethics Requirement for Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis Proposal, which is hardly a 4 or 5 page guideline is there, which clearly says a systematic review or a meta-analysis protocol has followed the standard guidelines and procedure, including prospective registration in a standard database or a registry. It does not require submission to the ethics committee for clearance. That means all systematic review and meta-analysis does not require IEC review. That is the verdict given by the ICMR guideline with regard to that. Guidelines ICMR Network Institution. Here, joint ethics review of multicentric research has been proposed, which was in 2023. Finally, the National Guidelines for Ethics Committees Reviewing Biomedical and Health Research during COVID-19 pandemic, April 2020. This ethics committee guidelines were released. To conclude, my dear friends, research is a privilege. As a researcher, you have an enormous responsibility. You are not doing anything great to the community. You are putting the participants at risk. Hence, do not misuse this power. Ethics of research is paramount. You do not put the participants at risk. Risk versus benefit has to be weighed. Before conducting any research on human beings, please take ethics committee approval, informed consent from the participants. Keep updated about the newer biomedical research ethics guidelines, new laws and regulations. Finally, if you are a EC member, that is ethics committee member or a researcher, please go through this guideline, read many times, understand it, and uphold the ethics of research. Thank you very much for giving your valuable time. Stay safe.